Okay, welcome everybody. I want to hold up the 3-volume set that is Little Anton, and this is what we're going to be talking about today. This is the book. To describe this as, it's really a historical fiction saga, but to describe it as riveting, smart, sexy, a World War II spy thriller, all that doesn't do it justice. I think if, in the descriptors, you can probably add to the words, you can add the words suspense, mystery, drugs, drama, love. And, I think there are great portrayals of some of the time's most iconic historical figures, and I could probably go on. Hi, everyone. My name is Jim Alcon. I'm the editorial director of BookTrib, the leading source of news and reviews. And I'm excited today to have as our guest, John Warner IV, who is the author of Little Anton. That's him. That was him. Just to give you a little background, John is a writer and a gentleman farmer whose passion for history, vintage cars, and the unsung heroes of World War II has inspired a couple of large-scale projects. One of them is a documentary series on the early bootlegging days of NASCAR, and the other, of course, is our subject for today, Little Anton. John, how you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
Good. Well, glad
thank you for having me.
No, we're excited. We're excited to. There's so much. When you look at a volume like this, there's an awful lot to tackle. So we're going to try to get into as much as we can. Just as a little way of background, for those who don't know, John is the son of retired Senator John W. Warner III. And again, if you don't know, former Secretary of the Navy and Chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and Catherine Mellon, the banking heiress and daughter of philanthropist Paul Mellon. So, John has said that growing up in a family that has had a seat at many of the world's most historically significant tables has led to an insatiable quest to find and reveal hidden truths about world events. So John, let's start out by telling us a little bit about that experience, what you experienced growing up and sitting at those tables, and how it influenced your writing.
Well, when my parents divorced, I was 10 years old, and my father was Secretary of the Navy. But before that time, I would always do my homework at the Pentagon. It just worked out better that way. And so one thing my dad did was he was gone a lot, but what he would do when possible is he would take me with him. And so I traveled to every Navy base and a lot of military installations, Buckingham Palace, the Kremlin later on in life. I had a much better education with my father. I was a very poor student in school, bad attitude. I wasn't really, much of a student. But he gave me an incredible eye onto the world through that. And I was very fortunate to have the Navy and Marines, around me all my life. I mean, they fed and clothed me, so to speak. And I was always passionate for history, and I was always in the school library looking up things about World War II or I, or the Civil War, or, ancient history and the pyramids and the Egyptians and, pre-dynastic stuff here and there, rather than doing my homework. And the school could never figure me out. They couldn't figure out why I wouldn't apply myself at all the other boring stuff. And I was like, this is what I want to do. And of course, I ended up being a C student all my life, but, I have this great imagination, as they would say, too much of an imagination.
Well, it sounds like you were interested in what they were teaching. You just didn't want to learn it in the format that they were presenting it in. It sounds like I'm assuming you enjoyed traveling with your dad and seeing these experiences, and just what you just described about going in and having these interests in all these different areas where they might have been teaching in a classroom. You were kind of doing it on your own and in a different manner than most.
I was very much a person who would like to see things for myself. People learn much better. You go to a foreign country, you learn the language and the culture much quicker and better than in a classroom. I was never a classroom guy. Even in college, I would just do everything else I wanted and just sort of, trundle along with the basic degree. But in history, I excelled. It came natural to me, but I'd rather experience it for myself firsthand. I think being on an aircraft carrier with my dad, you see things, you see the world differently through those kinds of experiences.
I would imagine. So you're a self-described gearhead. You spent much of your adult life quenching your thirst for knowledge about race cars, first as a professional Grand Am and American Le Mans Series racing car driver. When and how did you develop this passion?
That passion coincided with my passion for history and military history. I started reading the car magazines in the school library. I went to the National Cathedral School system, and to their detriment, they had 2 or 3 car magazines, and I was always interested in engineering. I was never an engineer, but I was interested in the subject. And my mother taught me to drive when I was age 12 on her car, which had a 4-speed. She's like, take me to the market, And in rural Virginia, that was no big deal with a parent in those days. Although 12 was a little young, she had to put a booster seat in for me. But after that experience, as any gearhead can tell you, you get a taste for that. And it was my father who got me into racing. I had a very fast car in college when I was 21. And I took him for a ride, and it was a Ford Pantera. And I bought it used at the local Charlottesville Ford dealer. And this was a 160-mile-an-hour mid-engine car. And he got out of that one day and said, good God Almighty, you're going to kill us all. And so he said, I'm going to go take some professional driving lessons. I'll pay for them. And I said, all right, I'm going to Skip Barber Racing School. And that was it. The end, 20 years later, I ended up racing professionally in the IMSA and Grand Am, the American Le Mans Series, all that stuff against some of the best drivers in the world. And I wasn't very fast or anything, but I was very consistent. Teams like that. They like a consistent driver. And so I would get hired sometimes just for that. But the racing fueled my passion for little Anton, because the story of the German Grand Prix sort of war between Auto Union and Mercedes, and of course Alfa Romeo and the French, that's not known by a lot of people. And that was a major propaganda coup for Hitler and Goebbels and the Nazis. You always hear about the 36 Olympics, but you hardly ever hear about the Grand Prix. And so I started digging into that, and I used to race for Porsche. So Ferdinand Porsche was always a character I couldn't get enough of. And so I started digging into the story, and lo and behold, it was all technical engineering history and racing history, but very little about the man as a family man, as a pacifist, who he was really. And so I had to travel to Germany twice and really research that. I started to know more than the museum people. And so I really wanted to flesh him out as a human being.
Yeah, I would imagine, and I think the book probably gets into other sides of a lot of these characters that and historical figures that would surprise people, and we'll get to that in a minute. The book has been called, when you have a volume as large as we just showed, it's been called a lot of things, everything from a part love story, part satire. It has so many storylines, I've heard it called historical fiction, a history lesson, a love story, spy story, family saga. I could probably go on. If you were at a cocktail party and we were talking to somebody trying to describe the book, of all those things, what would you call it? How would you describe it?
It's a juggernaut of a doorstop, so at least people can use it for that.
Right, you have to work out in order to pick it up. No, I'm sorry.
Yeah, for my first book, I started writing at age 50. So I was laid up with a back operation, and a friend of mine said, buy a laptop and write a book. And I said, that sounds boring. And he urged me to do it, a good friend from school. And lo and behold, I could write. I don't know how, but I was able to teach myself to write, to translate all the imagination going on in my head into something palatable. The book is many things to many people. I've had people say I only like the love story part between B and Lutz. And some people say they love the stuff about the Nazis, the SS, and the occult. which is a sub-theme in the book. That's all based on true events. A lot of the book is true, the racing stories and everything. It's a big read. It's a big epic story. I'm the first one to admit that. I tell people to take their time. It's not a book you're going to read in a weekend. But a lot of it is based on truth stories. I really enjoy the truth better than just pure fiction, but I've interwoven all that stuff. A lot of people won't believe some of the stuff about the Nazis and the cult, but I from my perspective, it is very true. And I do believe the Germans were into anti-gravity experiments and their wonder weapons program. There's really good evidence for it if you dig far enough. And of course, that's why I had Nick Cook on a podcast, because his book, The Hunt for Zero Point, was a great influence to me. My other projects have to do with the military industrial complex, UFO phenomenon. My cousin Chris Mellon is into that. He and I are interested in that subject, and I delve slightly into that. There's what my wife calls infamous chapter 108. And it's a briefing that B gets from her boss, McMaster, who's a bit of a mystic. He's more than a bit of a mystic. And this is a 1938 style briefing of his version of what's really going on in the world and how the world is really ordered. And she flips out, as anyone would. But when people quiz me on that, I tell them I truly believe in that. I believe in what I write. People can disagree, that's fine. It doesn't matter. But there was a lot of research. I mean, it took me 10 years to write. So a lot of research went into that book. And of course, my humor, I hope, helps move it along,
I mean, most, we talk about, some of the hidden truths and revelations that you get in the book. I can't imagine how the average history student would ever know that Grand Prix racing and the rise of the Third Reich had a connection. I find that just amazing. How, I guess that was a function of your research and how did you go about merging these two, seemingly vastly different themes?
Well, I didn't have to. It's true history. It's just forgotten history. Most history students in high school and college are taught a very thin, perfunctory, slice of history. As Napoleon said, it's a pack of lies agreed upon by the winners. Throughout my career as a historian, self-taught, you begin to see how much of history is just ignored. And you have to ask yourself why. And I think it's because a lot of it is inconvenient history. They don't teach anything about the occult, which is just hidden knowledge. That's what the word means, hidden. And they don't teach you anything about the mystery schools of Egypt, and unless you specialize in those things. And of course, everything is connected. Carl Jung said, synchronicity, all points of space and time are connected. And Carl Jung has a lot of family history for me. My grandmother, Mary Mellon, was best friends with Carl Jung. My grandfather as well. And when he was in the OSS in World War II, which is the forerunner of the CIA, Carl Jung was a member. And my grandfather and Alan Dulles were involved with Carl Jung. Listen, you need to do a psychological workup of the Nazis. And I mentioned Carl Jung in my book. And he said, some of these people are crazy, but the other ones, they're not crazy. We shouldn't lock them up. We should hire them. And that's what happened after the war. As they stopped hunting Nazis, they really started to hire them. And, some escaped to Argentina, like Mengele and others. But whether Hitler died in the bunker or not, I don't care. He was a very sick man. He was on a cocktail of horrible drugs for years. It's the racing history is true. Porsche knew Hitler. Hitler was a fan of Porsche. He knew about him in World War I. Most people don't realize Ferdinand Porsche built aircraft engines and other machinery, gun tractors and electric trains for the German and Austrian-Hungary, militaries. And so Porsche was well known in World War I. Do you remember Franz Ferdinand, who was assassinated in World War I start? Ferdinand Porsche was his chauffeur in 1903. So when he would travel all through Europe, Ferdinand Porsche was his chauffeur. He was an Austrian army soldier. And so they said, well, Porsche is a gearhead, let him, because Franz Ferdinand was interested in Zeppelins and engines and tanks and whatever it was before World War I. So that history is fascinating. So my book covers a lot of ground, but most people think of Porsche and they know something about VW, Bug, and Hitler, but my book explains all that history, how the Bug came about and how difficult it was to make a Volkswagen Beetle for under 1,000 Reichsmarks, you know, and that all that story is true about his design works. And so it's you know, I kind of wrote it for people who are into that kind of stuff, but there's a little bit of everything for everyone in the book.
Well, as you were talking, you probably spoiled my next question a little bit, but we'll try it anyhow, okay? I want to play a little word association with you, or name association, if you will. I mean, the book is said to reveal a lot of hidden truths about many prominent leaders, you know, active in the World War II era. So what I'd like to do is throw out a name for you and see if you can reveal one of the hidden truths about them, or if you don't want to, you know, give away a hidden truth right now, just tell me something about their role in the book. But I'd rather have the hidden truth if you can do that, okay? Ready? Let's start with Adolf Hitler.
Yep. Adolf Hitler. His middle name was Elizabeth. There's so many things about Hitler. I mean, you know, you can go all day long. I personally believe he made it to Argentina after the war. I think there's good evidence for that. There's no way to prove it in court. He wasn't the idiot madman to the degree that people think he was. He was at the end of the war, you know, with the drug cocktail and making a lot of mistakes. But if you look at his political career, he was a political genius. I mean, he was a bloodthirsty madman, but someone who could, you know, his speeches and everything else, he's very dysfunctional in life, but you get him on a stage and, you know, he was mesmerizing. And so, to my knowledge, he was definitely associated with the Tula Society, which was, you know, a secret society right at, you know, before and after World War I. A lot of people dispute that. You know, in my view, it's an absolutely clear connection. And they thought he would be a messiah for the German people, incorporating these sort of peaceful, you know, utopian concepts that the Tula Society had. And of course, Hitler was like, nah, I'm going to reverse the swastika, you know, and instead of friendship and good luck and the creational torsion field power of the cosmos, it's going to mean inevitable victory. And of course, he had Buddhist monk advisors all through the war at the Reich Tibet Institute. A lot of people don't know that, because the Tibetans really believed in the Germans at first, that they were going to get things done and make this a more, you know, free energy for the world, and 0 point energy that Nick Cook and I talk about, and other things. But no, the Nazis were all into, you know, let's conquest, you know, let's conquer the world. It's a very sort of reptilian part of our psyche, you know, conquest and aggression and war. And we all, you know, humans live in duality. And that's all part of the yin and yang of everyone. But the Nazis really took it to the extreme. But I mean, you could write, there have been reams of books written about Hitler. I mean,
right. It's not like you can sum him up in a couple of sentences, but let me throw another name at you, Winston Churchill.
Yes. I read a lot of his books, which influenced my writing. He's funny. He's very well written. He's one of the best writers that ever was. Churchill was a hero in World War II, but his earlier life, he was anything but. He was a very controversial character. I like him. I think he was, let's put it this way, in the Vedic tradition of India, there's a concept of the light warrior. And a light warrior is someone who can err onto the side of light instead of darkness. But Winston Churchill was definitely a dark character for most of his life. I mean, he sent in the black and tans to Ireland. I think there was a shipment of grain for Africa that he let stay in port, and it rotted and people starved because of it. He didn't have a lot of nice things to say about India and her peoples. He called them a beastly people with a beastly religion. Wow, I was like, uh-oh. But in my second book, I cover more of his dark side. But when the chips were down in World War II and we had a worse person, trying to conquer the world, he was the bully that the British people needed at that time. You do not want a choir boy. You want someone who understands the dark side, who has been part of the elite, who understands those people and knows how to fight them. I mean, if you look at the movie that was out recently in the last couple of years, The Darkest Hour and some of the other ones, they show you how the British, they were like, we need to concede. And he's like, no, we will never rise again if we give in to this person. They will, darkness will encroach over the world. And he was right. Churchill was a Freemason and a Rosicrucian, and I think he was part of the Hellfire Club. That's debatable amongst historians, but oh no, these secret societies, they never go away. They change names, and so he was definitely part of that occult. And so was Franklin Roosevelt, President Roosevelt. So I cover this in my new book a lot deeper.
Okay, let me throw one more name at you, Ferdinand Porsche.
My man.
You've already told us a lot about him, but keep going.
He's a very interesting man, especially to people into racing and the Porsche brand and the VW history. He was a genius. His family were pacifists. His idea, going back to World War I, had some logic to it, in that create better war weapons, faster planes, better military equipment. The wars will end sooner, saving lives. Now that didn't turn out to be the case, but he firmly believed in that. He was a very flawed man, but he was very much a family man, and he loved racing. He didn't care about weapons and war. He did that because he had to. A lot of people will say, no, he's a Nazi, and that is true. But all the big industrialists by 1940, they had better be part of the Nazi party, or else. I mean, they would put your family in Dachau. And they would have done that if he said, no way, I'm gonna, But you have to remember the times. He cared about his young Austrians and, the Germans around him. He knew these people. He knew their sons had gone to war. Who would not create the best military weapons and gear, for their troops dying at the Russian front or elsewhere? I mean, you have to, say that. But Porsche was always interested in racing, and immediately when the war ended, he went right back creating race cars. He was a man that he was in the SS. He was awarded the Death's Head ring, but he's not a person that was on board with that program. There were the Volkswagen works at Wolfsburg in World War II. They had 20,000 slave laborers. I have a German translation of a book I had to get done by some CIA people who were translators, because I needed it in my bibliography, and the only way I could read it was that had it translated out of German. So I had to get some German-speaking peoples to do that. And it's the history of Volkswagen.
I'll tell you, we could probably go on and on with more and more characters. It's fascinating listening to you describe them. Let's turn a little bit to a fictional character, Lady B. Tell us a little bit about her role in the book, and what the inspiration was for that character.
The inspiration for B comes from many people in my life. My wife, there's a little bit of Elizabeth Taylor in there, my stepmother, a little bit of my mother, who's a rebel hippie in her day. And I think there's a lot of my mother in B, because my mother went against the grain all her life. And in polite society, the Mellons, these committee of 300 families, the ruling families of America, they call them. There's an unwritten code that says conform or else. And B is one of these people who's like, screw you, I'm not gonna play this game, I'm gonna be myself. And so her cadre of friends are troublemakers, a lot like my friends growing up. We're outsiders, we're outcasts. things like that. And so B is this rebellious, hard drinking, hard cussing, who hates authority, as a bad student. I mean, there's a lot of me in there too, She's a lot of fun to write about because she really doesn't care about what anyone thinks. And she's also very human and insecure, but yet she's able to be trained as a soldier, trained as an operative. She's an air racer, a pilot, she can race a car. I mean, she's a gearhead. And I know women like that. And there's a true woman in the story called Amy Johnson. And Amy Johnson, if people look up her life, there's a lot of Amy Johnson in B, and they are very best friends in the book.
Okay. You tackle a lot of real big themes for the period, in this book: industrial history, the women's movement, international relations, America's foreign policy, engineering challenges. Tell me why those particular themes were important for you to incorporate in the book.
As my research went along, I started to get into alternative history sources. And I strongly feel those are more reliable than the mainstream ones for a lot of political reasons. And, like the German atomic program was much farther along than we're led to believe. I think there's good evidence. There's a US Navy report called the Zinster report that describes an atomic blast in the Baltic on an island. I started to get into more revisionist history in the book because all history is revisionist, if you think about it. A high school history book was this thick 100 years ago. Now it's half that size. Ask yourself why. I used to ask uncomfortable questions in school and they'd be like, you don't need to know that. That's not important. And I found that to be very arrogant and short-sighted. So, my family, the Mellon family, the Rockefellers, a lot of the big wig banking families, they were doing business with the Nazis in the 30s. They didn't know we were going to go to war. But, Standard Oil, which, is part of Gulf Oil, and the Mellons are heavily invested, back in the day, they were selling that to the Germans through Portugal. It's dirty history. FDR tried to curb that, but, a president only has so much power. All those corporations and big banks are well above the presidency. That's absolutely true. My great-grandfather, Andrew Mellon, the stories about him are horrendous. He and his fat cat robber baron buddies, Rockefeller, Carnegie, and everybody, they had a lot of hand in dealing with the Great Depression and how that turned out. And they didn't, their policies were outdated. That's very suspicious to me. So my own family's history is connected with all of this. And that's why I put Mellon character in the book and I talk about the Mellon family, because we are part of that history. And, Andrew Mellon had Harding and Hoover, he was Secretary of the Treasury. I've been told in very reliable sources, he gave them their marching orders when it came to the banking stuff. You need to do this. And presidents were like, okay. That's a sad fact of the world. My father and I have talked about that for 40 years, how senators and congressmen are basically bought and paid for. Special interests, corporations, the military, it's a fact of life. And so I weave a lot of those uncomfortable narratives into the book because they're relevant to what was happening. I give the reader a sense of what's happening behind the scenes, not just the racing and what B is up to, but what's going on geopolitically, because I feel that's important.
Well, especially the breadth of the book, and when you're hitting all of these characters and all of the perspectives of where they come into place, you have to put it into some sort of historical context. So that's great that you address those. We could probably dissect this book for another couple of hours. I want to ask you just quickly, tell us a little bit about the sequel, Lion, Tiger, Bear. Where does that take the story?
The sequel starts off in 1942. It ends in 1942, or the beginning of 1943. I haven't sussed that out yet. But it starts in the Desert War with Rommel. And B is in big trouble, as usual. And she's in a very dire situation with a couple of soldiers in a plane crash in Egypt. And but the book is much heavier hitting. I get deep into the occult. And chapter 1 is going to be very disturbing for people, but my wife and I went back and forth on it, and it has to do with, human trafficking and the occult and what's known as satanic ritual abuse. And this was part of, the darker side of the occult, not the lighter side. And it happens. It's part of our reality. This is the Jeffrey Epstein was up to, sadly. And I won't apologize for it. It's going to be really rough. But it gets into, a lot of what's happening with the Foo Fighters in World War II. Guess who? These were UFOs of their day. Most people think it's a band from the 90s. They got their name from this. And of course, General Jimmy Doolittle of the Tokyo raid fame, he was in charge of Roosevelt's Foo Fighter, secret program. And so was Wild Bill Donovan, who was my grandfather's boss in the OSS. So this gets very chummy, as far as how that was handled in World War II. And I dive deep into that. And I get into more of the German anti-gravity program. My characters are on a mission in Iraq, in the Zagros Mountains, looking for ancient relics and things like that, which the SS Ahnenerbe, which is the archaeological history portion of the SS, under Ernst Schaefer and others, they're all in the book. These are real characters, and they did real things. And of course, I get into a lot of esoteric concepts and a lot of alternative history, some of which, a lot of which I believe personally. A lot of people think this is nuts, he's crazy. That's fine. But if you dive deep into a lot of this stuff, you start to realize that, our history is this Swiss cheese, nothing burger. They've changed it so many times, but that takes real effort and, reading. You have to figure out the little missing puzzle pieces and where are they? How is this built? It dives deep into all that, but there's a lot. It's shorter, it's faster paced, and it's a lot more action. And of course, there's more love in it. The and Alice.
And that's coming out later this year, but certainly until it does, readers have plenty to jump into with little Anton. If you could leave the readers with one last thought, just to say in terms of what message you'd like to leave them, or people contemplating the book. Obviously, you've taken us in many different directions and has many tentacles. What could you say? What could you say to them in terms of what they're going to get out of the experience of little Anton?
It's a really 3 books in one. So it's an epic. So it needs to be treated like a multi-part novel. I know that's intimidating for people, but it has a lot of things for a lot of different people in it. It's a tough read. I'm the first one to admit that, but it's also, if you have any interest in, a lot of stuff that's hidden knowledge, you might like it. It also gets into World War II, combat, and there's a lot of things in there. It's a big read, but I assure you, I did the best I could, and I tried to research it very, very well. But it's very controversial. A lot of people who've read it really like it, but they're like, I just don't agree with you in this part. That's okay. It is a very, very controversial project, a series of books. But I hope the humor, the human element of it, the people's personalities, I hope people enjoy that, because I really enjoy, it's narrative driven, it's dialogue driven. And so the people are arguing and talking and making love and all that stuff. It's very, it moves the pace of the narrative along. But at its very core, after all that stuff, it's a love story between 2 young people caught up in a maelstrom of war and everything else.
Well, it sounds like a great read. That's our discussion for today. We're out of time. John, thanks so much. It's been great chatting with you and getting to know a little bit more about the story behind the story. That story, of course, is Little Anton, which is highly recommended. Thanks again, John, and until next time, be well and safe, everybody. Take care.